What's happening and what's up? Hold out your glass because we're about to fill it up. Welcome to the Prometheus Lens podcast, the place where the conversations are always enlightening. I'm your host, Justin, independent researcher, podcaster. You may know me from my works with the Dig Bible podcast. This is just a solo project where I like to look into fascinating subjects and use basically the allegory of the Prometheus lens to re-examine everything. Have you ever liked looking into old myths and epics and really break those down and the meanings behind them and compare them, to the biblical narrative and just see the common themes throughout history? You found yourself in the right episode. Today, we're going to be going over the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth. And we have a expert guest, 10,000 plus hours and then some, Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, thank you for coming on and talking with us today.
My pleasure.
Now, this was something that I had heard about and just, some caveats and little tidbits, but I actually broke down and bought this book maybe a few months ago and I read it, and it was just through a biblical lens. It was pretty amazing to see all the connections and correlations with their creation myth and ours. I like how it started out. Tablet 1, it starts off and it says, "Before the glories above had yet to be named." And immediately I thought of Second Esdras, chapter 6, verse 4, because it says, "Before the measures of the firmament were named." Because first you had what they called the Abzu, which, I took as the abyss, and Tiamat were the things that were already there in the story. They were not created, they were just already there. Could you care to speak to that?
Yeah, the similarities between the Sumeria, or in this case, the Babylonian creation epic and that in Genesis has been a topic of scholarly debate and discussion for going on 2 centuries now, really, almost 2 centuries anyway. But the imagery, the themes that are being used there, the elements of chaos and formlessness can be seen also in the Enuma Elish in the form of Tiamat, who was the chaos dragon in Mesopotamian mythology. And the other word you mentioned there is very pertinent too, the Apsu. Um, herein sort of represented as a celestial being, primordial being in and of its own right. Later, of course, is not only the name of the deity, but it's the name of the realm that the dead ancestor kings, or rather the ancestor god kings, would reside in, the Apsu, this watery underworld. And it really sets the pace for the ancient world, that association between the sea, waters in general, with chaos. But again, the similarities in the imagery, very hard to get past, and that was something that the scholars that first worked on the Enuma Elish, understood. And that's you know you mentioned the passage in Esdras there, but all the imagery of the first few verses in Genesis, as we'll see as we go through. We could spend the whole show on the first tablet and
Mm-hmm.
not even get past the other ones. But yeah, you're right. The similarities are there. Um, they bear the question of why the similarities, and by proxy, why do we find so many similarities in creation epics and mythological traditions around the world? Insofar as that we're looking at different tellings of the same event in a lot, or a series of events in a lot of cases. It's just that story wasn't left inert and in situ. It was manipulated and changed, and it was engineered in places by fallen entities that are variously called Egregori and the Watchers, the fallen angels. that show up, for instance, in Mesopotamian mythology as these elder gods. The Apkallu would probably be the best direct correlation. But yeah, the interesting similarities there go beyond just the scholarly study of these texts, but speak um, they speak to general concerns for humanity, I think.
And one thing too, just the verbiage and things like that, it says that in Genesis where it talks about the deep, the Tehom,
Hmm.
correlates straight with Tiamat, and then the waters,
Yes,
was Yam, so that's the same story, just different names.
right.
But in Isaiah 51 and verse 9 and 10 talks about the cutting of Rahab and wounding the dragon. And it says the
Mm-hmm.
waters of the great deep. There's that word again, to home. And then in Isaiah 27:1, it says, shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent. He shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. So we see two, quote unquote, lowercase g gods. And to me, it looked like, they were different names. So it's like comparing it to this Enuma Elish. Is that maybe who they're talking about there? Maybe Abzu and Tiamat, one being male and one being female. Because when it talks about their waters intertwining and making their first offspring, I immediately thought of, that's an allegory for they mated and made
Right.
their first offspring.
Yeah, it's an interesting proposition to consider. Doug Van Dorn and I did an episode of uh, the Blurred Creatures podcast where we talked about, this idea of of procreation amongst the gods. In other words, are there amongst the gods of the nations are there also female, entities? Is this, the as above so below, which is an occult saying, but it's actually a perversion of as it is in heaven, as it is on earth that we read in things like the Lord's Prayer. Just like everything demonic is a perversion, a counterfeit of the original. Um, uh, you know, the question that came up was, and that we dealt with for much of that episode, uh, was, you know, are there female deities? Is there a kind of procreation amongst celestial uh, deities? And again, if that logic holds true, that's a question that's worth asking. Um, but the again, the topic of Assyriology, which is kind of what we're plumbing the depths of here, because that's really kind of where you need to start. We're dealing with text literature from Mesopotamia that have a not just a cultural context that's important, but a history of the actual scholarship that's done on them is important. And we should probably say a few prefatory things in that regard, to the audience. Um, those of you out there who listen to, these kinds of topical discussions on podcasts, are probably familiar in some way, shape, or form with the Enuma Elish. You've heard, our good friend, the late Dr. Heiser, talk about it. You may have heard me talk about it. You may have heard Doug Van Dorn, Derek Gilbert, Tom Horn. It's fodder for good comparative discussion, because again, it speaks to the things that I mentioned to you a moment ago. Um, but the Enuma Elish is a short, as just pointed out, is a very short, 7 tablet accounting of the Mesopotamian idea of creation. And the tablets themselves have an interesting history all of their own. Um, the first copy was discovered by an archaeologist named Henry Laird in the mid 1800s, and I remember reading about the Enuma Elish and its discovery in my, you know, ground level archaeology classes, because usually half of the curriculum there is the history of archaeology. And so Layard is one of those guys who really kind of pioneers the field of ancient Near Eastern studies, Assyriology, even ancient Near Eastern archaeology. He, along with other big names like Rawlinson and E. Wallace Budge and Sir Flounders Petrie, all of these guys kind of they basically invented ancient Near Eastern archaeology. But Layard's find was groundbreaking, uh, only because it confirmed the existence in its well, probably not its original form, but in a historical context that established its veracity, because there were other versions basically of the Babylonian creation myth that existed in copies and writing. We find it in Alexander Polyester writings. We find it in the writings of a 3rd century BC priest of Baal, or Marduk in this case would have been the direct analog, a guy named Brocerus, and it's copied later in Eusebius's. A lot of people know who Eusebius is, basically the father of church history. He wrote the history of the early church, but he also wrote another document known as the Chronicon, and it contains a version of this Babylonian creation myth that these earlier writers had pinned down. And that's what makes because classicists would have been familiar with these, because we're dealing with Greek literature essentially, people living in the ancient Near East writing in Greek. So classicists would have been familiar with this stuff, but the find of Layard and his team at Nineveh, what would today be modern Mosul in Iraq, is pretty groundbreaking insofar as that it corroborates the existence in space and time of these sources. So this particular find was part of the Ashurbanipal library. Ashurbanipal II was a well-known Assyrian king, and he had this huge cache of documents that's collectively become known as the Ashurbanipal library. And you've got heavy hitters like the Gilgamesh epic, and everything from that to the most mundane kinds of court records and trade records and things like that were kept here. But for the longest time, these were curated by German museums. And in the wake of, I think it was the first Gulf War, in the wake of that war, they were trying, in other words, the Iraqi Antiquities Department was trying to get a lot of that stuff back, with mixed success. But needless to say, this is one of those watermark finds in the history of archaeology. And Layard, of course, he's a rock star in the history of ancient Near Eastern archaeology. On his team was a guy named George Smith, who a few decades later would make the earliest of the complete translations of the Enuma Elish. And Smith, of course, himself was a prolific Assyriologist. In fact, I use a lot of his stuff in my ancient Near Eastern program that I teach through the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. So if folks are interested in that, they can certainly check that out and sign up for classes if they want to. But Smith, again, another one of those consummate, Assyriologists. And it's thanks to him that certainly there's been more work done on the Enuma Elish since then, but Smith's translations are still public domain. You could go on the internet and read them right now. So which I would recommend people because it's a quick read. It won't take you that long to read through them. Um, Problematic is the fact that we do have some gaps in the text. The actual Mesopotamian word used there is lacuna. So there's several of these scattered throughout, as you would expect, because the tablets themselves were not in perfect condition. Um, it's even in the best kinds of condition for preservation. We often find fragmentary, copies and fragmentary evidence, and that's the case with the Enuma Elish. But there's enough of it intact that you get a pretty good sense of what's going on with the epic itself. Um, Undoubtedly, there were earlier copies of this because, of course, the Assyrians were late in the procession of civilizations that ruled over Mesopotamia. You had the Sumerians beginning in the 4th millennium BC, the Akkadians in their wake. Then you had the Amorite Babylonian Empire, and then the Assyrians come along about 1000 BC and have a stint as well. And after the Assyrians, the Babylonians or the Neo-Babylonians. So there's a whole procession of civilizations that rule over Mesopotamia. So, undoubtedly, and certainly we can derive this from other Akkadian Sumerian finds. This existed in forms earlier, probably much earlier than this. And the myths themselves must have existed in oral form for millennia uh, before the Sumerians even start writing things down. And there, that would take us sort of into the fields of things like comparative mythology, because you need to look at the other mythological traditions in the ancient Near East, like the Phoenicians and the Canaanites and the Amorites, and even peoples like the Hittites and the Hurrians in Anatolia, ancient Turkey. But you're going to find a lot of similarities in those myths. So undoubtedly they exist in a more centralized oral form in millennia, even prior to when cuneiform was developed. So we're talking about, yes, our best copy of the Enuma Elish dates to this Assyrian period, but these are ideas that are being written down much later than they existed in the minds of the people that believed in these things, that you know that actually had experiences with these entities.
What's happening? What's up? Hold out your glass because we're about to fill it up. I always said that I would never bow to any corporate sponsor. But hey, rest assured, this ain't corporate. Kevlar Joe's Coffee Company, been a sponsor of my show, the Dig Bible Podcast. They've come on board with the Prometheus lens. I'm here to tell you guys, if you like good, bold, smooth finished coffee, check these guys out. I'm a personal customer, been that way for quite some time now. The breakfast blend, real good for the morning. But then you got, for your hardcore guys that like their coffee with a little bit of legs, they have the Flightline Joe. I'm telling you, ladies, don't drink this because it's going to put hair on your chest. But no, guys, if you want to help sponsor the show, help keep the lights on, go on over to KevlarJoes.com, check out their stuff, and see what blend you like. He's got several to choose from. Oh yeah, I mean I totally agree with that. You have oral tradition in all cultures, and it travels. For hell, who knows? I mean, thousands of years before somebody finally gets the bright idea to write them down, and the changes and things that go through all these stories before they're actually written down. It's just one of those things. It's you're never going to know, but you can assume. There's been some changes made and things like
Well,
that.
and we're
But I appreciate you.
we're we're learning a lot more now about the antiquity of civilization in Mesopotamia. Um, that we typically think of the Sumerians as the earliest, but there were cultures who were basically living in city-states before the Sumerians, all the way from eastern Turkey down to the mid ranges of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. One of those cultures was the Ubaid, which was a Neolithic culture. In fact, um, Sumerian cities like Uruk and Nippur, um, these were actually built first by the Ubaid before the Sumerians. The Sumerians in fact, there's a debate now as to whether the Sumerians learned how to build things like ziggurats from the Ubaid. And even before the Ubaid, you had the Halath culture in what would have been eastern Turkey, northern Mesopotamia, northern Iraq, um, on a par with those settlements that the Ubaid made. And so the not just the antique nature, but the very primordial nature, the prehistoric nature of these beliefs is sort of gradually coming to light, not just in terms of the archaeology that's being done there, but the linguistic analysis of things that are coming out of that region as well. There was a brand new, previously unknown language in ancient Anatolia that was recently discovered in Turkey. So, to my mind, um, Turkey and Eastern Turkey in particular are going to be revealing quite a bit about the just the foundational primeval prehistoric nature of these beliefs that were written down in things like the Enuma Elish.
I mean, that's just amazing, and that's why I wanted to talk with you, because your mind is just, I mean, it's been years of dedication and study to get there, and I just really appreciate that. I got a tendency just to jump into stuff, so I love that you backed up and prefaced all that and gave the history and the background for all that stuff, because I mean that's important. And I usually, like I said, I like to get ahead of myself. Sometimes Steve and Ben has to grab me by my coat there and pull
Uh-huh.
me back sometimes. but uh, but yeah, definitely. And then of course with me, a layman, I always used to tell people, well, yeah, you see all these similarities and these stories throughout the world in different cultures and different languages, because, my theory was Tower of Babel.
Mm-hmm.
We were once, all together, one tongue, one nation, telling these same stories. And then when the languages and the nations were divided, the people spread out and told the same stories in their language. And then over time, like a telephone game in school,
Mm-hmm.
it gets caveats and twists, and then you got the whole, spiritual, warfare side
Mm-hmm.
of it, like you mentioned earlier, fallen angels coming in and putting their twist on it and corrupting it and everything. But it's like looking into it, there was just, I mean, I knew there were several, but there's like everywhere. I mean, it's even in India.
Mm-hmm.
You have Thor battling this serpent that bites its own tail in
The
Midgard
Midgard
and
serpent. Uh-huh.
myth Norse, yeah, in Norse mythology. And when Ragnarok, the end of the world comes, this serpent rises up out of the sea
Mm-hmm.
and does battle with Thor.
Mm-hmm.
And then over in India, you have Krishna.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all this, as Derek, I've heard him call it chaos comp,
Mm-hmm.
imagery. But yeah, I like how you just broke all that down with the histories and things like that, and especially with the discoveries and I know you've been working with and Aaron Judkins wrote his book, The Guardians of Gobekli, and that was an interesting read too, about how everything we know about history is just ass backwards,
Well, yeah,
and that thing is so old. And
not to get too far off topic, but it still is pertinent because we're talking about Mesopotamia. You mentioned the Tower of Babel a moment ago. Um, you know, I'm more and more convinced that that people have been looking for Babel in the wrong place in the wrong time. Um, Historically, just in terms of like biblical scholarship and biblical studies, people have wanted to line it up with these ancient Mesopotamian civilizations like Sumeria or Arcadia or Babylon in particular. Um, but it just seems to me that if you look at something like the Proto-Indo-European language shift, which happened about 6000 BC, you know, people in that part of the world, from the Proto-Semitic region of Turkey and parts of northern Mesopotamia, all the way into what would today be the Transcaucasus between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, for all intents and purposes, spoke mutually intelligible dialects of the same language. Um, you know, this reverse engineered language that linguists call Proto-Indo-European is the mother tongue of most of the languages in Europe and Asia. And so the breakup of that language occurs, you know, uh, at least a couple of millennia before Sumeria is even established. Probably longer. That's 6000 watermark date. 6000 BC is it's just a generalization of when all of those languages broke up. We're talking about millennia before that this Proto-Indo-European was spoken, all throughout that region. And so for all intents and purposes, just as Genesis lays out, we spoke one language. And that confusion of the language, I'm more and more convinced, I'm having to go back and look at some of my linguistics and sociolinguistics textbooks from graduate school. But I'm more and more convinced that this Proto-Indo-European language shift is the Babel event that's recounted in the Bible, and we should be looking in Eastern Turkey for a physical location, not in middle and southern Iraq. We're looking in the wrong place and the wrong time.
Hmm. That's definitely a wild concept because it's just a paradigm shift from what we're all, raised up and taught and have learned.
Certainly predates, the civilizations that scholars have usually lined up the Babel event with. And now, of course, again in Turkey, we're with sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and Novali Chori, and even some later ones like Chateau Hayuk, which we've known about for decades. We're finding out that city-states existed in the late Mesolithic and the Neolithic period, much earlier, thousands of years earlier than cities like Uruk and Nippur. So, we we don't know what we don't know yet, but we're learning.
Yeah.
This is a revelatory time for a number of reasons, and I would encourage people to pay close attention to what's going on in Turkey in terms of archaeology and linguistics and new discoveries.
Yeah. That's wild. Uh, but getting back with this Enuma Elish, where it talks about when their waters intermingled,
Hmm.
they fathered Anshar and Kishar,
Hmm.
and it said that after many years was their firstborn Anu, and he was greater than the rest. But then it says he fathered Nudidamud. Is that
Hmm.
correct? Nudidamud, and he was even greater than the rest, and he was described with strength in his limbs and profoundly
Hmm.
wise. So, speak to those two entities there.
Well, I mean,
Basically, Anu was like the father.
it's it's
The
it's analogous to what you find in the other mythological pantheons. You're looking at this procession of the genealogy of the gods. You know, most people are at least somewhat familiar with the procession of sovereignty from the Titans in Greek mythology down to their offspring, the Olympians, and then you had lesser gods and demigods. It's the same kind of thing that you see take. You've got the most primordial gods at the top. So in the case of the Enuma Elish, it's Tiamat and Apsu. So the analog for that in Greek would be um, uh, the just the sort of primordial void. I almost said soup. I don't want to make it sound like an evolutionary discussion. But you can kind of see what I'm talking about because later you have Uranus and Gaia, the heaven and the earth, which we're getting into with Anu and Ki. Um, and then their progeny are set out and they'll rebel against them. And this is repeated over and over, even in our tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, following from the Hebrew, the same kind of procession takes place. You've got the most primordial elements, you know, in the first few verses in Genesis, the Nakash in the garden, and then you have another fall, another group of celestial beings that have sided with this coup, and their progeny become another tier of that. So it's the same kind of procession that you find, um, you know, in most of the pantheons of mythologies in the world. Um, you can almost find direct analogs for each one of those. And so that, going back to how we began the discussion tonight, um, there's an original story, but it's corrupted, by these fallen entities, um, almost almost in a kind of cultural engineering fashion, where you get variations on a theme. Um, which is interesting because that we're actually seeing the same kind of thing play out with the way that our language is changing in the modern world, particularly in the West, with the way that it's basically been weaponized and is being used against us. But not to get too far off topic, but you can see that we're talking about the establishment of a genealogy of the Mesopotamian deities.
And you see that rebellion through here,
Hmm.
but I think it's wild how they make it out to basically uh, the gods, the babies were the rowdy bunch.
Hmm.
They were just too wild and too rowdy, and Absu couldn't get any sleep. He was the angry dad,
Hmm.
and then goes to Tiamat, which was the mother, and was like, we got to kill them. I can't get no
Hmm.
rest. It's time to take them behind the woodshed, and she gets angry and upset, and the children basically rebel, just like you said, the Mount Olympus turning on their fathers, the Titans, and overthrowing them. So you see that same imagery here. But when you get to down the genealogies here, and once they kill the father and set up shop again, you see the whole thing starting to repeat again.
Hmm.
And Ea, or how you say that
Yeah.
name? I know it's spelled
Yeah.
EA.
Yeah.
Is that
Hmm.
right, Ea? But bore Marduk,
Hmm.
and I'm no scholar, and I know you can't judge by English with these ancient names and the languages and stuff. But I immediately just thought of in Genesis when you go through the genealogies and stuff. Uh, Nimrod
Hmm.
had a son that died in battle, and I always was like, is there a correlation with the original languages, or is this just a coincidence here, like a veneration of his
Right.
son
Well,
almost?
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of the analogy idea that we're dancing around here today. Um, and that's really the merit and value of something like a comparative mythology, um, is that it there's something called structural analysis in anthropology and linguistics, where you take these binary opposites, uh, you pick out binary opposites and structure in mythology, and you can certainly do that here in looking at the a character like Gilgamesh and Marduk. Although a lot of scholars will equate Gilgamesh with uh, Nimrod, or I think Nimrod and Marduk was the analogy you were making, but Marduk is interesting for a number of reasons because he becomes such a dominant element in Mesopotamian mythology at this point. He's really like the Zeus
Yes, I was about to say Zeus. Yeah.
the Zeus or Jupiter or Baal. He's really that kind of figure at the top of the conquering pantheon. Um, Marduk, of course, is given the task, and without letting too much of the cat out of the bag, because I do want people to read this, folks. It's a quick read, really, and it's worth your time too. And I've found several audio adaptations of the Enuma Elish. If you're busy and you want to listen to it, that's a good way to get familiar with it too. But Marduk is basically given the task of of killing off a lot of these primordial monsters that were created during the course of the narrative of the Enuma Elish. Um, and I always like to use Marduk uh, in a discussion of another popular topic, and that is Nibiru, which is also referenced in the Enuma Elish in conjunction with Marduk. A lot of people are probably familiar with that word Nibiru in the context of something like Planet X or Zechariah Sitchin. For those that aren't, the long and short of it is that there was a writer, kind of the forerunner of the Ancient Aliens crowd, with along with Eric von Daniken, but there was a writer named Zechariah Sitchin who claimed to have most accurately translated a lot of these ancient Sumerian documents, like the Enuma Elish and the Gilgamesh epic. But a lot of his translations were so far off that it was clear that he really didn't have any grounding training in cuneiform or Syriology. Uh, in fact,
Even Dr. Michael Heiser tried
he
to
did.
challenge him to debates and stuff, and he
He wouldn't
wouldn't.
do it. In fact,
He's like, dude's just making this stuff
I,
up.
I remember I remember the Coast to Coast AM episode. I was in graduate school and I was listening to it, and Mike was on there, and he told George Norway, Art Bell. I think Art Bell was on his way out. George was coming in, but he told Art, he said, Sitchin's translations are off. Nibiru is not Planet X. He's got the whole Anunnaki coloring off. But anyway, uh, he never did debate Mike. Um, Probably because he knew that he would lose. And, he had already fleeced people out of millions of dollars writing this mound of bull feathers that amounted to something like 10 or 12 books on the subject. Uh, but um, the thesis in these books is that Nibiru was this rogue planet that made this circuitous route into our solar system every, I don't know, 3,600 years, something like that. Um, and would exert some sort of control over the earth at that time. Nothing could be, in terms of translation, nothing could be more wrong, um, because Nibiru or Neveru or Nibiru, or any of the transliterations that you usually find, the forms you find it in, more often than not are associated with Marduk's star in Mesopotamian astrology and cosmology. Now, Marduk's star was the planet Jupiter. In fact, I think even in the Smith translation, which was the first one out of the bat, it's translated as Jupiter. And people can look this up. It's not hard. You could go online to the Oxford University site, and they have a, a glossary where you can look this stuff up. You know, there are a handful of others that you can go to as well. So it's not like it's hidden knowledge. But I always get a kick out of these, ancient aliens guys and YouTubers and stuff like that they refer to the quote unquote Sumerian documents, and the work that Sitchin had done. Um, and it's clear to anybody, any freshman that's had cuneiform, that he's purposefully changing the meaning of these words to suit his narrative. And it's the Mesopotamians themselves that clarify it, because they wrote their own grammars and lexicons to help us understand, or to train, people in writing and scholarship, because only a small portion of people wrote in the ancient world. But those glossaries and grammars are still around. They've been translated, and so we know exactly what they meant. So if people are interested in Nibiru and want clarification on that, again, the Enuma Elish is a great place to start, because it lays it out there. Um, that's not to say that there may not be a rogue planet, somewhere. It's just not the one that Sitchin is talking about. That's a completely fabricated narrative that you find in his books.
Well, see, still like in the first tablet where this rebellion
We're
is
we're
started to
gonna
take
have
place.
we're gonna have to do a whole series on this if we're just in the first tablet.
Yeah, man, we definitely did. I'm down for it. But when the, it, she when she finds out, and when I say she, I'm talking about
Mhm,
Tiamat, that the rebellion was about to happen, she starts just creating all these monstrosities,
mhm,
all these monsters. And I mentioned to you before the show there was some uh, words in here that I was just totally lost on,
mhm,
and linguistically, I knew you'd be the man to talk to, because some of these monsters sound very interesting to say the least.
mhm,
But it says that she brought forth mighty
mhm.
serpents with poison for
Poison
blood,
for blood.
and then she enlisted a horned snake, and it says a Mushushu dragon, a Lamu hero, and a Ugalu devil,
Mhm,
a scorpion man, and a Umu devil.
mhm.
Uh, Enlighten
Oh yeah,
us
God,
and some of the listeners
this
on
is
what these things
a
are.
list of baddies. If I'm not mistaken, I think the Lilu is amongst some of those. That may be in a later tablet. I'm trying to remember. Um, at any rate, these are the monsters that bedeck a lot of the iconic, archaeological finds in the ancient Near East. Not just in Mesopotamia either, because there are mentions of these in other traditions. I mean, even in the Bible, there are references to things like scorpion men and lion men, and these
Well, the book of Revelations, them
exactly.
weird things that come out of the
That's
abyss.
exactly right, and they hearken to the kind of manipulation that the Watchers took part in, as articulated in Enoch. Because there weren't just hominid Nephilim, there was the corruption of animal, DNA of all kinds apparently, which resulted in a number of kinds of hybrid creatures. And so a lot of these are those kinds of hybrid creatures, like bull men and the scorpion men that you referenced. Yeah, there's a whole host of interesting creatures that are made here, which are interestingly analogous to the hybrid chimerical kinds of creatures that you find in the other mythologies, not just in the ancient Near East, but even in the peoples that drew off of that mythology, most directly the Greeks, because it's been established that a lot of Orientalization took place, influence of these ancient Near Eastern mythologies on Greece. And there are similar kinds of chimerical creatures, um, like uh, the centaurs and the satyrs. They're like the Adzaga, uh, um, who I think is also mentioned in one of the creation tablets, if I'm not mistaken. Adzaga was a goat deity that was half man and half human, essentially. Um, so the thing to remember here is that these creatures were these sort of Frankenstein experiments almost, and that's true of the Enuma Elish. It's true of the Genesis narrative that's sort of expanded in the apocryphal literature, like Enoch and the Genesis Apocryphon, and some of these other mythologies. But um, that's part of the merit of looking at the Enuma Elish, is because you do find these similarities with the biblical narrative, particularly the Genesis narrative. That's really what we're focusing in on in the first few chapters of Genesis.
Well, this was something that really stood out to me. Uh, as she prepares her battle and she, has all these monsters, she uh, basically marries this other, god named Kingu,
Hmm.
makes him her soulmate, is what the book says,
Hmm.
and her
Hmm.
chief of her military. But
Hmm.
then it says that she bestows upon him the tablets of fate, and he clasps them to
Hmm.
his chest. Like I said, I'm just a layman, and the only lens I really got is, like the biblical one. I was like, is this basically like a priestly ephod, the garments of from the Garden of God, or what's your take on the tablets of destiny or fate? I'm
Well, I
sorry.
mean, it certainly could be that the tablets of fate, um, and are interesting insofar as that, um, you read later in the Enuma Elish about the Anunnaki, which were another, corruption of, most people that have heard about the Anunnaki know about them from Zechariah Sitchin. God help us. Uh, but the Anunnaki were associated with the carrying out of fate, um, and so they're well, a lot of those entities could be seen as analogous to some of the giant tribes, some of the lower tier uh, gods. Marduk, in fact, is one of them. He's one of the Anunnaki. Um, but in terms of like an actual artifact being handed, that's an interesting proposition. Um, you know, the the apocryphal literature, like Jasher and Jubilees, and is rife with this kind of stuff, um, such as the garments that Adam and Eve had after they were cast out of the garden. According to apocryphal tradition, these were heirlooms. They were symbols of patriarchy that were handed down the line all the way into the historical period. Um, and that in fact Nimrod at one point in time had basically stolen. And so here's an example of an artifact of divine origin that may provide some analogy. Another one is the discovery of the writings of the Watchers, which I find inordinately fascinating, by Arphaxad. And I think that's in Jubilees, where that account is given, where he finds um, the writings of the Watchers and basically uses their knowledge, to kind of restart that demonic, agenda in the early post-flood world. Again, we're all taught, all of this prospectively is happening in eastern Turkey, northern Mesopotamia. So that again, people really need to focus on discoveries that are coming out of that part of Turkey. So there may be something there. It's just hard. It's hard to quantify because we don't have any smoking gun. We don't have any evidence that would show us that these so-called, tablets of fate, um, were a distinct artifact. But the precedent is there in the literature of that region. So who knows?
And you see the correlations, with the Apocrypha and
Hmm.
other, religions about these, powerful items that are handed down and that the gods fight over. And,
Hmm.
uh, because even when Marduk defeats Kingu, it specifically tells you and that he takes the tablets of fate because Kingu was not deserving.
Hmm.
So it was obviously important enough to, after he slayed him, to take them.
Hmm.
Just like when Esau slayed
Slave Nimrod,
Nimrod,
exactly.
he made he took the
Hmm.
garments before he fled
That's
away.
right.
That's just
Which is interesting
really cool.
that's interesting in and of itself too.
Yeah, and just to see, once again, the
Hmm.
correlations of these different cultures, different times, and just the similarities. And it's just, to me, it's amazing. And like you said, we have no smoking gun. Basically, all we have is interpretation and speculation of all these different similar and sometimes even
Right.
exact stories, just with different
Well,
names.
the thing about even the sort of conjecture, the scholarly conjecture is valuable because we can do that, because we do have these textual resources to go off of, and we can find the connective tissue between them, and we can see the analogous narratives that are taking place. Um, so if those things can be developed into hypotheses and later theories, then there's some merit in doing that. So um, the problem is when people don't take the time to, at least familiarize themselves with the Enuma Elish or whatever, collection of documents that they're doing, and then just proceed based solely on interest and not any kind of authority. And that has a lot less to do with degrees behind your name and just putting in the hours, to familiarize yourself, and it depends on how deep you want to go. I mean, there are people that are abundantly familiar with Mesopotamian mythology and literature. They and may not be able to read cuneiform. You at least are building a familiarity, with the literature and an authoritative, stance to make your statements from. Um, and some people are diehard about it. They want to go in, they want to learn cuneiform, they want to learn how to read this stuff and there's certainly merit and value to that because you pick up on nuance and idiom. But that's why people need to be discerning. And I'm speaking to people in general, but specifically for Christians that are interested in this. There are tons of people on YouTube and in the cybersphere and and they they may give you a really glossy, eye-catching, video or interview or something like that. But a lot of it is bunk because they haven't put in the time to actually develop the authority. They've not familiarized themselves with the literature and the scholarship um, and so that's why you end up with your Zachariah Sitchins and your Eric von Dänikens and, it, they don't spend the time necessary to develop the proper authority, and that just leads people into bad conclusions about these documents. But there's value and merit here in looking at things like the Enuma Elish and what similarities are with Genesis, but it takes a studious mindset, as from reading this stuff yourself. Um, it takes a scrutinizing eye, um, and the patience to actually familiarize yourself with this stuff and make grounded, not only conclusions, but like we've even done some conjecture tonight. You know, I really like what Mike Heiser used to say on French Pop 321 that Aaron and I are about to launch into hosting. Mike used to always say that the world we live in is strange, but your thinking doesn't have to be. And the same can be said, of studying the Enuma Elish comparatively with the Bible. And so my advice for people is to leave the Sitchin out of it and look at the work of scholars, that have gone before us, like Dr. Heiser, who did so much great analogous work, between the Mesopotamian stuff and the biblical stuff.
And like you were saying too, it takes a lot of times a simple Google search
Mm-hmm.
to find some resources and check these things. That's what I tell people,
Well, yeah,
often is, look into these things yourself. Don't just repeat what people say, and even stuff I say. I
sure,
mean, I ain't God. I got more questions than I got answers, but I got postulations. So if I tell you my idea or my thought on something, don't just take it for gold.
sure.
Go look it up and see what you
Right.
find.
Well, and people can, there's so many resources out there now, just as with biblical studies, you don't have to be a linguist. We've got all these resources now that can shed light on a lot of that stuff. And resources like even academia.edu that anybody can get, a subscription to. You get a lot of these scholars have already done the groundwork, they've done the heavy lifting for you. Go and see, you don't have to agree with them. Go to them and see how their scholarship lines up with the biblical narrative. If they're doing something on Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish or anything in the ancient Near East. I was looking at my academia feed earlier today, and there were several papers, that came up on it that had direct bearing on Mesopotamian literature and the Bible. So, this stuff is it's just out there. We've never been at a time where we've had so much access to this information and so many people not really wanting to make use of it. And that's the great tragedy. But anyway, the Enuma Elish, go there in a night, find a copy, read it. It'll probably take you 20 minutes to read it.
Yeah, yeah, it ain't bad at all. But I don't have my copy with me,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a little bit thicker because it had footnotes
Yeah,
and study
yeah,
notes, and
yeah.
it was really great because like when it would have a certain phrase on some stuff, it would have like a plus sign or a hashtag and little symbols, and then when you got down to the bottom of the footnotes, you found those symbols,
Mm-hmm.
and it give you like some talking points and notes on things. Like I love looking into like what's the word for it, not astrology,
Mm-hmm.
astronomy, like in ancient texts and even in the Bible. It's all through the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, it's a perversion, on earth as it is in
Mm-hmm.
heaven. They turned into as
As above,
above,
so
so
below.
below.
Mm-hmm.
But tablet 5, man, oh man, I'm so happy that whoever translated that and wrote that book took the time to put in all those notes and those
Mm-hmm.
footnotes, because the layman like me would have never ever made those connections.
Mm-hmm.
It, and it's basically because of his work or her work, I made a connection with Deuteronomy 32
Mm-hmm.
when I seen that, because it says, after they defeated chaos, and then they, basically just like the Norse mythology, busted up the dragon and used its
Mm-hmm.
pieces to build Earth, where the Norse destroyed the giant
The
Ymir
frost, yeah, Ymir.
and
Mm-hmm.
used his
Mm-hmm.
parts to build the Earth. It was the same thing. So, but then he basically divvies out portions for all these gods to rule,
Mm-hmm.
and where it says he constructed various stations for every one of the high gods concerning the stars, and he placed constellations for each one, then established the year and set forth its
Mm-hmm.
subdivisions. So he was talking about the
Right.
zodiacs. He assigned 3 stars to signify each of the 12 months. And then in that notes, he talked about how each constellation had 3 stars that they called deacons.
Mm-hmm.
And it said, so he set forth the station of Nibiru to delineate their movement, Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
It says, and then he made stations for Enlil and Ea, the 2 hemispheres, the north for Enlil, the south for Ea, and the equator ones for Anu, and made the recent moon to rule the night as the indicator of days, never failing each month in its circle of light. And the first of the month, your horns, was an indicator for 6 days. And on the 7th, your crown is a half darkness. The waxing moon now is half moon. And it says the 15th day will be halfway at every month midpoint, called Shabbatu, which was the same root origins for Sabbath, is what it said in the notes. It says, and a time when Shamash, the sun god, faces you opposite horizon. Shamash ultimately determines the year's length. So basically, it was telling you a 12-month year of 30 days. And, and I hope whoever reads that finds, that version, because a lot of that stuff that I added in there was obviously not in the ancient text, talking about zodiacs and all these things, but
right.
Even the mention of the bow star, he said it was, Sirius. There's so much there.
Yeah. And, we're finding out now that some of these astrological divisions, maybe on some of these older monuments in Turkey, that we're finding now. I'm thinking specifically of some of the stela, the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. Time will tell. The archaeoastronomy is still being worked out, but what you're looking at in the Enuma Elish here in the tablet is the division of not only sacred time and space, but mundane time and space. That's the gods of the nations connection there. But there's a lot of, people will recognize the kind of imagery that you find in Genesis, in the division of the night and day, and, the light and the dark, all those kinds of things, are showing up, in the Enuma Elish as well. Again, folks have to remember we're looking at, at different versions of observations of the same event. So that's why you're going to find a lot of those similarities in there. But yeah, that's the deity correlation here definitely has to do with the division of the earth into the domains that would be ruled over by the gods of the nations as described in Deuteronomy chapter 32. And we know how that turns out. And from the biblical perspective, none of them seem to have done the jobs that they were appointed to do. They failed rather miserably. So people need to remember that too as they're reading the Enuma Elish to get the not just the Genesis contention, but the ultimate, the ultimate downfall and failure and demise of the gods of the nations.
And one interesting thing that I found was when it described Tiamat and her parts. It said he took the various parts of Tiamat to create the earth, and he took her thigh to hold up the vault of heaven. Half of her body made the earth, and the other half the sky. But it says, then her insides he twirled so that the insides of Tiamat spun. Is that, am I looking too deep into this, or is it like, do these people already know that we were on a globe spinning around?
Well, I mean, you basically got all 3 dimensions, spatial dimensions represented here, don't you?
Yeah.
Length, breadth, and width. So, yeah, it would seem that, that would be the case here, and certainly there's precedent for ancient peoples knowing that the world, was a spheroid, uh, a globe, if you will, because of the way that they could watch vessels disappearing over the horizon. They disappeared full first, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to turn this into a debunking of flat Earth or anything like that, but yeah, I mean,
No,
that's an ex.
we got a debate with Greg Locke and that other guy coming up pretty soon.
Oh yeah,
Have
that's
you heard
right.
about that?
That's right. Yeah. But this speaks to the sense of not just local geography, but planetary geography that the ancients were familiar with. Um, just in their case, largely just by observing the movements of those celestial bodies that were most proximate to the Earth. So yeah, you do have chambered Earths and different shapes of the Earth that are encapsulated in a lot of these ancient mythologies. But usually the nuances of the words that are used to describe the shape of the earth are either misunderstood or taken out of context or misused by people who are arguing against a spheroid earth. But clearly ancient peoples, prehistoric peoples even, could tell uh, the shape of the earth just because, by virtue of the shadows that were cast on the earth and the shadows that the earth cast on bodies like the moon. So um, the but what makes it this interesting is that it's grounded within the text of something like the Enuma Elish, and arguably the Bible. Although neither one of these books is a science book per se. They're both they're cosmologies. They're setting the stage for everything that happens in the realm of supernatural, that happens in the realm of the gods. It happens into, again, if I can borrow a word from Dr. Heiser, the unseen realm. That this is the procession of events and the groundwork, the context, uh, the culture that they existed in, because that's also something that we don't often think of, is that this realm had its own culture, had its own cultures. It had, it, our earthly cultures are derivative of the original culture, which was a supernatural one. It was the one of the unseen realm. And so, these are things that people need to be thinking about too when they read something like the Enuma Elish.
And I was wanting to ask just for clarification because I've read that book by Dr. Aaron Judkins, but
Mm-hmm.
it's been a little while and several books, behind,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm getting older. My memory ain't as good, but I remember him talking about how he thought, there was astronomical correlations with that.
Mm-hmm.
And if I remember correct, what he was saying that there was lots of bull or bullvine
Oh
imagery,
yes, yeah.
and basically how the deacons and the constellations set up,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't explain that well, but basically when they line up a certain way, that's the age of the bull or something like that.
Yes, the aurochs was a prevalent depiction. The aurochs was a Pleistocene era, bovine. It was larger than the bovines that we have today. Probably
Like behemoth.
yeah, somewhere on the order of, probably a little bit smaller than Bison antiquus. Bison antiquus is probably about 7 feet, 6 or 7 feet at the shoulder. So we're looking at an immense animal. Um,
Yeah.
any way you dice it, but the aurochs, you know, dies out in the early antique period, basically. But the bull becomes this. It becomes associated with the kings of these pantheons, and so Marduk, Zeus, Baal. They're all tied to the imagery of the bull. And we're finding that in these prehistoric, sites. So clearly people had in prehistory had a more in-depth, a more comprehensive knowledge of the movement of the stars than we ever thought about giving them credit for.
Yeah, I mean that's just plain as day when you look through the not only the text, the archaeology, and,
Hmm.
and the stories, and it's there in our Bible too.
Sure.
It's just been kind of whitewashed and desupernaturalized
Hmm.
to get the weird, in my opinion, to get the weird out for some
Hmm.
reason. But it's like, the book of Job, you have so much talk of stars and the creation of stars, the mentioning of the wandering stars in Jude,
Hmm.
and can you bind Pleiades, and uh, grab the Leviathan, by its nose, and just it's all there. It's just I don't know, either just whitewashed or misinterpreted.
Hmm.
Well, I won't keep you, man. I can ramble on with you for another 2 hours, but I know you got things to do.
Well,
But I appreciate you.
let's do some follow up. I mean, I think we're just starting to peel this onion back.
Yes, sir. I want to. Yeah, definitely. We'll do a part two.
I think we've laid the groundwork pretty much for the first tablet. We should start going into the rest. We sort of piecemeal picked from other tablets, but we could start with tablet two.
Cool. Let's just go through each one and just tear them
Yeah,
apart.
absolutely. And I tell you what,
Sweet.
if people are interested, there are probably a number of programs that I have at the institute that would be of use to them. The Ancient Near Eastern program covers the history and religions of the ancient Near East. So people would be looking at Mesopotamia and Anatolia and Egypt and the Levant. And I'll also have biblical demonology and mythology, which would probably be of use as well, since I reference a lot of material from the ancient Near East in both of those classes. So if people are interested, they can go to burtonbeyond.net, and the institute is part of that website.
Yeah, awesome. And I was actually curious about that. And since I got you on the
Sure.
line, how does that work? Is that like, you pay for a certain class and then you get access to like pre-recorded
Well,
stuff and some
the
literature,
way that
or
it is now, I'll go ahead and kind of synopsize it. I have 6 programs, and there's 12 courses apiece in each one, so they're all topically uh, delineated. So a few I mentioned already: biblical demonology, um, world mythology, ancient Near Eastern civilization. I also have a Mediterranean civilization, which covers all of the Mycenaeans and the Minoans and the Greeks and the Romans. And I have the flagship program, which is biblical anthropology, and all of these study the culture, history, and religion through the biblical lens, the divine counsel lens. Um, and the program classroom platform is in Google Class. And once people purchase they can buy the whole thing, or they can pay by month. So you become a student member that way, and you then get access to whatever program classes you have. There's reading material that's generally provided for each one. So I have links um, to the stuff that, if you want to buy a hard copy, you can, but people aren't required to. And so you have weekly readings, and you you take notes, as you're going through these books, and those are basically your assignments for the classes. And at the end of the program, you write a summative paper on a topic related to what you've been studying. And that gets you the certification, the certificate from the institute. Um, I'm constantly adding to. I've got video content that I need to put up still yet, but it's going to be the class stuff is only going to get richer. So I'm always going to be throwing stuff at it that's not necessarily required for the certification, but If people want to listen to an interview that's pertinent to it, or a lecture that's pertinent to it, or I may have some recommended readings, if you want to go further. It all depends on what the student wants to get out of it. I've got a lot of people that don't really want the certification; they just want the information, and so that's fine if you want to do it that way. Um, Generally, I have students go through each class, on a 4-week basis, so the material takes about 4 weeks to complete, and that's really the pace that you need to stay at. But otherwise, people can do that whenever they get to it. So it's all tailored to people that have jobs, and we've all got families, and we've got other stuff that we're doing, and this material was so important that I felt that a program needed to be developed to fit around everybody's schedule. So it's not like we have class meetings, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you have to be there. We do have in the Facebook page. In fact, we're starting the first live stream chat this weekend. So there'll be monthly, that's another perk that you get with the student membership is, there'll be these monthly discussions with me with each of the related programs.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Like, far as like pricing, what's the pricing for that? Is there
Well,
uh,
the
like monthly
yeah,
payment subscription or
if you do,
buy it
you
all?
can do a yearly or a monthly. If you do the yearly, you get a pretty substantial savings. So each of the programs at that range are $250. If you do the monthly, uh, it's $27 a month. So it's still a really good deal. It's just when you buy the whole package up front, you get a substantial discount.
Nice. See, I've been wanting to check into that for a while now, and I know we've had you on a few times, and I was like, next time, because I seen you and Brandon talking about it on Facebook, and I was like, I want to get the deeds on that.
Well, the really popular one right now is the preternatural morphology one. That's the Monsters 101.
Cryptids.
Yeah, the vampires, the werewolves, the chimera, the zombies. Um, that one's really hot right now.
And it's just also the fascination of it and the paradigm shift, because most people, they're like, monsters and
Yeah,
cryptids and werewolves in your
yep.
Bible? Nah. What'd you say earlier? I loved it. Bull feathers?
No, bull feathers.
Is
Yeah.
that what you said?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I'm stealing that. That's funny. But guys, yeah, check out Dr. Judd. As you can see, if you're listening to this podcast, you've heard him before, and I'm sure you're well familiar with him. So go support his work and expand your mind. Until next time, torches high. Are you a member of the Prometheus Lens Podcast members only group? And if not, what are you waiting for? Come join the band of brothers on the hero's journey. With this members only package, you get early access to episodes, you get special episodes that nobody else gets, special video content, documentaries, and you help support the show and keep the lights on. Doing podcasts, they can be very expensive. A lot of people don't realize all the subscriptions, the website fees, the video and audio subscriptions, and things like that. So if you enjoy the content, help keep the lights on, help me keep doing what I love to do, and keep bringing you fire each and every week.